Okay, it's time for us to jump back on that magical history tour bus and explore 1968, the music and the times. Boy, what a year this has been. There was a lot that went on, and hopefully now as we move into the fall, things will cool off a little bit from the tumultuous summer we saw in 1968. As I head back to college, my band, The Darkness, is officially over, as the other bandmates are now going to college as well. Things are hopefully starting to cool down, but the hits just keep coming. So let's drop the needle. At college, almost as a ritual, twice a week, I would go into the town to probably the only record store that was in town to look through the new records that were coming out and to purchase the best ones. Well, one week there in September, I walked in and picked up the fourth album by the Jefferson Starship. Boy, the cover really says it all, doesn't it? We are blowing ourselves up. The album is Crown of Creation. The kickoff song is great, if a bit weird. Lather was written by Grace Slick about the drummer of the group, Spencer Dryden, who was also her boyfriend. It contains the lyric, Lather was 30 years old today, and they took away all of his toys. And Grace actually requoted that on the Jefferson Airplane website in 2005 when Spencer Dryden passed away. The album also contains a David Crosby song that the Byrds rejected, Triad, which is about a menage a trois and contains the lines, So you see, what we can do is to try something new. If you're crazy too, I don't really see why can't we go on as three. Then there is If You Feel, Grace's Greasy Heart, and the minor hit, The House at Punil Corners. By this time, the Airplane had morphed into an albums-oriented group. The days of the hit singles of Somebody to Love and White Rabbit were miles behind them, but FM radio kept their music alive, and this album hit number 6. In London, a band that had formed way back in 1962 finally releases their debut album. It's called Pictures of Matchstick Men by Status Quo. They would go on to play at Live Aid and record over 30 albums, and their sound would become more hard rock and boogie. But at their start, they were a pure psychedelic band, and this album shows off that direction. Besides the hit, Pictures of Matchstick Men, there are remakes of the Bee Gees' Spicks and Specks, Tommy Rose Sheila, and the Lemon Drops' Green Tambourine, although this track is not on the US release. 3 notable things also happen in September, 2 of them on TV, and 1 up in Seattle. September US television history is made as the first episode of 60 Minutes debuts. And a new series called Hawaii Five-0 debuts on September 20th. It introduces us to Jack Lord and gives us a new catchphrase, Book 'em, Dano. Meanwhile, in Seattle, the world gets to see its first jumbo jet airplane, the Boeing 747. This has always been one of my favorite planes, and over the years, I've had the opportunity to fly all around the world. In fact, I've got 3 million miles on one airline and 2 million miles on another. I spent a lot of time on a number of planes, including my favorite, the 747. In October, the leaves start to turn, but the music keeps coming out. And in London, there's a band that comes out with its lead singer being a flute player. Yes, his name is Ian Anderson, and the group is Jethro Tull. And he's the only remaining member of Jethro Tull, and he's just recorded a new album as I record this episode. Wow. But this is their first record. It was released in the UK, and it was called This Was. Besides Anderson, the album features Mick Abrams on guitar, Glenn Cornick on bass, and Gary Bunker on drums. My Sunday Feeling by Anderson leads off the album. Then there's Beggar's Farm, Move On Alone by Abrams, and some instrumentals like Dharma for One and Cat's Squirrel. And then there's the great Anderson tune, A Song for Jeffrey. And if you're wondering which guy in the group is Jethro, well, none of them are. They kept changing the name of the band because they couldn't get repeat bookings. So they'd play as a group one place and then change their name to play another place until they discovered Jethro Tull. He was an 18th century British agriculturist. They used his name, and the manager of the club that they were playing in booked them again. So the name stuck. While we're on that side of the pond, up in Northern Ireland, the police start using their batons on civil rights demonstrators. And this is what has become called the Troubles. Jimi Hendrix Experience releases their third album, and it's the first one to be produced by Hendrix himself. It's called Electric Ladyland. Now, this album is almost as notorious for its cover as it is for its music, but let's start with the music, because there's so much in this double album. Setting the Mood is the leadoff, and The Gods Made Love. Then there's Have You Ever Been to Electric Ladyland, Crosstown Traffic, and Voodoo Child. Noel Redding has a turn with Little Miss Strange. Then there's Gypsy Eyes and The Burning of the Midnight Lamp, which is very atmospheric, and I liked it so much that I used it in one of my first student films. It was a great song. The film, not so much. Also listen to Rainy Day, Dream Away, 1983, A Merman I Should Turn to Be, and of course the great cover of the Bob Dylan song, All Along the Watchtower. Oh yeah, and about the cover. Now originally, Jimmy wanted to use a picture that was taken by Linda Eastman, who would soon become Linda McCartney. But for some reason, the record company decided no, and they used this out-of-focus picture of Jimmy. Jimmy hated it. In the UK, this was the cover. Electric Ladyland had 19 nude women on it. Hendrix has also said that he hated this cover as well, but then later he changed his mind. In Philadelphia, a new band took their name from an obscure song by the Yardbirds called The Nazz Are Blue, and the band was called The Nazz, and so was their debut album. The band was headed up by Todd Rundgren on guitars, vocals, and string arrangements, Robert Antonioni on keyboard and vocals, Carson Van Osten on bass guitar, and Tom Mooney on drums. The album starts with Open My Eyes. Then there's See What You Can Be, the great Hello, It's Me, the Lemming song, and She's Going Down. But what about that cover? Look familiar? It should. The Nazz recorded 2 other albums, and then Todd Rundgren went on to have a successful solo career and become a producer as well, and is currently touring with Ringo in his all-star band show. After Robert Kennedy was assassinated, Jackie Kennedy became more concerned about her safety and the safety of her children in the U.S., so she retreated to a Greek island and married a longtime friend, Aristotle Onassis, who could provide her with the security that she and her family needed. November 1968 was a very busy month for my favorite group, the Beatles. First off, George Harrison records the first solo album by any Beatle. It is called Wonderwall, and it's the soundtrack to a movie of the same name. It's largely an instrumental album, fusing Indian and Western musicians, including Eric Clapton and Ringo Starr. And just 10 days later, a second Beatle would record his first solo album. Well, actually, it's a duet. John Lennon and Yoko Ono record Two Virgins, their avant-garde first album together. The music is pretty forgettable, but the cover, not so much, as it has them both standing there completely nude. Now, retailers around the world had a big problem with this, and they actually put the album in a brown paper bag in many cases. If you have the album, as I've said before, I'm sure you have it for the cover. I'll bet you don't listen to the music. While 2 of the members were off making solo albums, they got back with the rest of the Beatles in the studio to produce the Beatles' only double album, the White Album, simply called The Beatles. When you look at the cover, you can tell this is a very different album than Sgt. Pepper's. In fact, over the years, this album has had a lot of controversy. Some people like it, some people don't like it. A lot of the criticism revolves around the fact that it seems like it's Paul with a backing group, John with a backing group, George with a backing group, and Ringo with a backing group. All the Beatles are kind of stretching out in their own individual pathways. But that's one of the things that makes this album so incredible. You never know what's going to happen, and there's lots of great music on these 2 discs. For the lead-off track, they mimic the Beach Boys, and the album opens with Back in the USSR. John offers a sweet Dear Prudence, Paul has Obla-Di-La-Da, which all the others hated, George has the great While My Guitar Gently Weeps, with a guest guitar solo from Eric Clapton, which he laid down in one take. Other greats are I'm So Tired, Paul's Blackbird, John's Julia, George's Piggy, Rocky Raccoon, Birthday, Ear Blues, Helter Skelter, which Paul said he wrote so that the Beatles could have a song that was louder than The Who. Then there's a great Revolution number 1. But there are some clunkers, like Why Don't We Do It in the Road, Honey Pie, Wild Honey Pie, and of course Revolution 9. Also in November, the Kinks record their sixth studio album, The Village Green Preservation Society, which I talked about in detail in an episode about the Kinks. Near the end of November, Van Morrison records his second studio album, Astral Weeks, and it's miles away from his first album. This is an atmospheric, almost concept album. Astral Weeks is the title of the first song. It starts with, "If I ventured into the slipstream, between the viaducts of your dream." It's obvious that we are in the hands of not only a gifted musician, but a poet as well. And away we go. Sweet Thing finds Van wandering through gardens wet with rain and counting the stars in his lover's eyes. Cypress Avenue tells a romanticized version of an actual street in Belfast, not far from where Van grew up. Madame George, at 10 minutes, is considered a masterpiece in creating a character study. And Slim Slow Slider closes the album, and it's about Van watching a young girl die. Although the album didn't really sell, it's been considered a classic, and 40 years later, Van performed it in its entirety at the Hollywood Bowl, and that was recorded and released on an album as well. As we reach the last month in 1968, in December, Frank Zappa records his fourth album with the Mothers of Invention, and in doing so, creates a new persona for the band. The album is called Cruisin' with Reuben and the Jets. Supposedly, this is a doo-wop album from a fictitious Chicago group. All the songs sound like they could be recorded in the 50s. I like Cheap Thrills, How Could I Be Such a Fool, Desiree, You Didn't Try to Call Me, and Anyway the Wind Blows. If you look close at the cover, there's a balloon caption that says, "Is this the Mothers of Invention recording under a different name in a last-ditch attempt to get their cruddy music on the radio?" It worked. Radio stations played Reuben and the Jets' song, Desiree. The album inspired a Los Angeles band that was headed up by Ruben Guevara. And they created a band and recorded an album that was called Reuben and the Jets For Real in 1973. And guess who produced it? Frank Zappa. And on TV in 1968, Elvis stages what's called his comeback special. This was a TV event that was separated into two sections. The first section saw Elvis doing sort of stand-up musical numbers, but it's the second section that I bet you and everybody remembers. And that's where Elvis and a few of his musician friends, sitting in a circle with a crowd around them, just started jamming and playing classic songs. This TV show signaled that Elvis Presley was back and that 1968 did not belong just to the Beatles. And in London in December, two amazing albums are produced and one concert is filmed that almost never sees the light of day. The first album to be released was released on the Beatles' Apple Records, and its producer is Peter Asher. And the album was an unknown American folk singer called James Taylor. Paul McCartney and George Harrison appear on the album. Great songs include Knockin' Round the Zoo, Something in the Way She Moves, which George Harrison was obviously so smitten with that lyric that he lifted it verbatim years later for his song, Something. The very upbeat Carolina in My Mind, Night Owl, and Rainy Day Man. The album sold poorly, and it was right around the time that Apple and the Beatles were dissolving and breaking up. So Peter Asher very wisely took James Taylor back to America, and they signed with Warner Brothers Records, and James Taylor started his phenomenal solo career. And the Rolling Stones record their seventh album in December of 1968, and it's a big departure from their last album, that hippie, trippy, Satanic Majesty's Request. In this one, we're all invited to a beggar's banquet. The songs are all now classics. The first song on the record is Sympathy for the Devil, and instantly you know you're in for a wild ride. This is followed by No Expectations, I Like Parachute Woman, The Amazing Street Fightin' Man, The Unsavory, Stray Cat Blues, and then the album closes with Salt of the Earth. Some of the critics have said at the time that this album was the perfect album to close the chaos that was 1968. Now, what about that live concert that was filmed but almost never released? Well, just 5 days after the Stones released Beggar's Banquet, they decided to stage a concert with some of their friends and call it the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus. The concept was it was going to be like a rock and roll show, but also like a circus show. And so they staged it over 2 days. Well, there's Jethro Tull, The Who, and they play a blistering mini opera, Quick When Wally's Away, Taj Mahal, Marianne Faithfull, and a one-off supergroup called the Dirty Mac, which includes John Lennon, Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, Mitch Mitchell, and Yoko Ono. And they played Lennon's Beatles song, Year Blues. Now, the Rolling Stones were, of course, the closing act of the concert, but after 2 days of filming and all the drugs and all the drinking, they were frankly exhausted, and they gave a very slipshod, poor performance. And Jagger hated it and wouldn't let the film be released. It's also been reported that Jagger thought that The Who upstaged him, and so that's a reason he did not want the film released. But years later, it did come out on DVD, and I'm sure if you check some of the streaming services or online, you'll probably find it somewhere. It's definitely worth a look for The Who, for the Dirty Macs, and yeah, also for the Rolling Stones. So as you can see, a lot happened in 1968. But as Steve Jobs always used to say, oh, and one more thing. Because in 1968, the world was introduced to the very first computer mouse. Now, the reason it was called a mouse is because it was wired to your computer, and sitting on your desk, it looked like a mouse with a tail sitting on your desk. Now, years later, we're all using Bluetooth, and there is no wire anymore. But they're still called mice. So I guess now they're tailless mice, like those 3 blind mice that got their tails chopped off. So to recap this amazing year of 1968, we started off in the winter months, and we looked at 12 albums. Then we moved to the spring, and we talked about 10 albums in those months. In the hot and crazy summer, we looked at 9 albums. Now in the fall, we conclude our Magical History Tour of 1968 by looking at 13 albums. Of course, that's not all of the albums that were released in the year of 1968. It's just the ones that I wanted to focus on. I enjoy doing these Magical History Tours. It's fun to take a year and kind of explode it open and give time to all of the music and talk about things that actually happened while this music was coming out. So I will be doing more of them, and the next time we do it, we'll be hitting the year of 1969, and you can bet there'll be some great music there. But you can also bet it'll probably take me a little bit of time to do that, because quite frankly, these episodes take a lot of work. But I hope you enjoy them. I do, and keep a rockin'. If you like this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.